Hi, everyone. Welcome. Come on in, get a good seat. Sit at a table near your friends. Remember when we used to be able to do things like that? We will be able to do things like that again.
Very soon, hopefully.
Type in the chat, let us know who you are and where you're at. I'm Nancy Frye. I'm here in San Diego, although my background doesn't look like that. Our weather never looked like that at all, but it is winter, so that's my acknowledgement.
Well, now that we've got some guests joining us here, on behalf of Teachers College Press, good evening, good afternoon if you're on the West Coast. Let me welcome you to our webinar this afternoon, and thank you for joining us. We are joined here today by Nancy Frye, who is a professor of educational leadership at San Diego State University, and Rachelle S. Savitz, who is an assistant professor of adolescent literacy at Clemson University. Together with Douglas Fisher, the two of them are the author of the book that we will be discussing today, Teaching Hope and Resilience to Students Experiencing Trauma. I just want to give you a couple of housekeeping items before I hand it over to Nancy and Rachelle. First of all, the book is going to be available to all the attendees here today at a 15% discount plus free shipping from the Teachers College Press website. So please look for the details about that discount and how to access it in the chat panel. Please note that all professors attending today can request an examination copy of the book for free at our website. Again, the link to that will be available in the chat panel. And if you have questions today, please be sure to ask them using the Zoom Q&A feature. We will set aside a few minutes for that at the end of the hour. And if you like what you hear today, please sign up for the Teachers College Press mailing list and hear more about our authors and the books that we're publishing for educators and teacher educators. And so without further ado, let me hand it over to Rachelle Savitz and Nancy Frye.
Well, hi, everyone. Welcome. And I saw that Amy from the Museum School in San Diego is here. Hello, Amy. I'm up in Hillcrest, so I'm probably not too far away from you. And Rachelle, I don't know whether you noticed that we've got some folks from South Carolina that are here.
We do. I see lots of names that I know, and I'm appreciative that you are all here, including people that I'm just getting to know tonight.
Well, we're thrilled to have you here. Let's go ahead and get started. So again, welcome to all of you. My name's Nancy Frye, and you've met Michelle as well, or Rachelle, sorry. It's been a long day already, Rachelle. I apologize. And so let's get started with just a little emotional check-in. How are you doing? Can tell us in the chat, what's something kind that someone has done for you during this past week? What's something kind? We're all about gratitude. We're all about appreciating the people that are in our lives. Oh, Karen, to have a son who empties the dishwasher, that is a watershed moment. Yeah, being nudged, Lillian, I love that, being nudged to accept a compliment, right? Sometimes we're not always really good about that. Oh, and getting new headphones. Someone mentioning your positive contributions, those validating moments with colleagues. Thank you, Kristen, so important. And isn't that good to hear? Cheryl, I imagine that's such great feedback to be able to note in particular when somebody appreciates that you created a space where there could be the kind of discussion that you were hosting. Oh, Jamie, how rewarding, sending links of where to sign up for vaccines here in New York. That's wonderful. We're still waiting in California for ours, but any day now, right? We're hoping. You know, so much of what it is that we do in working with young people who may have experienced trauma is that we can get kind of caught up in what that is and kind of forget to take those deep breaths to be able to recognize the things that we are grateful for in our own lives as well. And Rachelle and I are happy to be here with you today to be able to talk about what are some of those issues, and especially what it is that we can do within schools and within classrooms to really be able to address some of those concerns around trauma. You know, this is less about identifying who those students are that may have experienced trauma, but rather to be able to create kind of a trauma sensitive school as well. Rachelle, I'd like to invite you into this conversation before we get moving a bit further. Tell us some things about yourself. What brought you to this work?
Thank you for asking. So I taught for 12 years in different schools, starting in the Pittsburgh area where I'm from, and then down in Florida. And I traditionally worked in schools with significantly high marginalized populations. And I noticed that my students were consistently being thrown out of other classrooms, or there were just a lot of issues, so to speak, and I put that in quotes. And so it was always important to me to talk with my students and to get to know them and understand what are they going through inside my classroom, outside the classroom. And I just heard so much of their experiences and dealing with death, dealing with suicides, and it was just a lot that they were taking in on themselves. And I knew that there was a need then to address and discuss trauma in our classrooms. We needed to make it normalized so that our students didn't come to the door and feel that they were silenced or that they should be ashamed of something that happened, but that my classroom was an open place to have these conversations. So thank you for asking.
Well, and Rachelle, I'm going to ask one more question because I'm hearing some noise that's coming from your video feed. So do you want to tell everybody what's going on at your house?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't introduce myself right from the start. I do have a puppy, and I also live alone. So my puppy is in the room with a toy. And so I apologize. You will hear a little bit of banging as she is trying to get the treat out of the toy. So thank you, Nancy, for mentioning that, so everybody knows it is a little puppy, and you may see her at some point in time during this presentation.
It's actually a little tiny puppy, but given all the noise, you may be visualizing a really big dog. So if we get to see her, don't be too disappointed. She's a little tiny puppy.
Yes, thank you.
So our learning intentions during this webinar, during our time together, especially are to talk about what some of those characteristics are around trauma-sensitive schools and about those responsive teacher behaviors that go along with that as well. And finally, to really drill down a bit more specifically into things that can happen at the classroom level as well as the school-wide level to meet those social and emotional needs for students who are facing trauma, but also too for students who have not perhaps experienced trauma, but can also benefit from that important SEL. And Rachelle and I both kind of look through the lens of literacy. We both have a literacy background. We're anchored in all of that. And so for us, those literacy experiences are an important part of that. We also have some resources for you as well. That handout that Emily put into the chat for Teachers College Press that you'll be able to download after the end of this webinar include a number of different tools that are also featured in the book as well. They include things like the Adverse Childhood Experience Questionnaire, as well as teacher-student relationships scale. We'll talk about each of these tools. There's a social capital tool that's there, a whole list of wonderful resources for being able to find literature, and perhaps literature that you may not be as familiar with. We'll also have in there a learner empowerment scale. And then finally, a logic model for thinking through what a trauma-sensitive school itself can look like. What are some of the actions that we can actually take to be able to do that? So I'm going to kick off with some time just in talking about what trauma is, what it looks like, and here's what's important to note. Very often, we don't know a trauma or a set of traumas that a student has experienced. Rather, what it is that we see are some behaviors. So for example, here's Sarah. She's a middle school student. She's got some okay grades that are going on. But one day, Sarah starts a food fight in her school cafeteria. There's more negative interactions that happen with the lunchroom monitor, and Sarah is out of control. She is not able to calm down. She's not able to control her frustrations. And very often as schools, when we see things like that happening, we respond immediately and think about what the behavior is and what the behavioral response is. And that common practice then can lead to, for instance, Sarah being suspended from school. She violated some important school rules. She falls further behind in her work, and those feelings that she has of continuing to feel angry and feel alienated, they get magnified all the more. Unfortunately, too often as schools, we're looking at the outward behaviors of a student, and we fail to go a bit more deeply into that. Here's another student, Christopher, right? He's in 9th grade. He comes to school every day, but he's not interested in his classes. Here we are, many of us in distance learning, and we're finding that out too, sometimes not even showing up. He doesn't turn in his homework. He doesn't speak in class. In fact, when we do see any action from him, it's usually when somebody else is disruptive. He latches right onto that. He is loud. He's violent. He takes it to the next level. He's academically capable, but he's not doing well in school. And again, a common practice is the teacher saying, "What's wrong with you? Why are you failing this class?" Right? These kinds of responses can mask those experiences that we may not know about. Mary, she's a 3rd grader. She starts telling her teacher and the school nurse that her stomach hurts. She wants to go home. She's absent a lot from school. She's falling behind academically. And Mary has become herself a target of teasing because of her weight. And a common practice, again, is that in terms of her physical complaints, it's dismissed. There doesn't seem to be anything biologically that's causing a problem. They're just simply excuses to be able to get out of class. And the teacher is saying you got to make up for the time that you missed as well. Many times, the impact of trauma fit into one of these two categories, and sometimes both of those categories. We see on the academic side of it, students who have a reduced sense of cognitive capability. In other words, they are not learning in the ways that they typically could. Sleep disturbances, language delays, difficulties with memory, and their impacts on the social relationships as well. And this is especially prominent for most of us at school. We see the behavior, we see those relationships and those difficulties with relationships, and we wonder to ourselves, what is wrong with that kid? These are outward manifestations, but what it can do is mask the types of trauma that that child or that young person has experienced. So let's unpack trauma just a little bit more. There is acute trauma. That's one category of trauma. And in acute trauma, this is especially something that we are often aware of as a community, or we're aware of as a school community. There might have been a natural disaster, or we all know about a child that has suddenly lost a parent or a family member, or there's been some kind of violent experience that we may know about. That's acute trauma. But there's also chronic trauma, and this is a little bit more underground at times. With chronic traumas, these are experiences that are happening over much longer periods of time. And those chronic kinds of trauma can include things like neglect, abuse, whether it's sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. There may be, that child may be living in a community that's experiencing ongoing violence that's happening. Perhaps there is long-term illness that is in that child's family. A family member is experiencing long-term and severe, significant illness. That child may be experiencing some chronic homelessness or displacements of one kind or another. And it's important to note too that those chronic traumas also can be coming and stemming from structural oppressions and racism as well. And then there are those historical traumas, and those are those collective experiences that happen to a particular group across generations. And especially when we're talking about groups who have experienced historically violent colonization. For example, in indigenous communities, as well, slavery, segregation, racism, discrimination, those historical traumas can happen as well. All of these can manifest themselves in a variety of ways. We don't want to talk about trauma as being just this one uniform kind of experience, you know, the acute trauma side of it. There are lots of layers that happen within trauma. The Adverse Childhood Experience Questionnaire was a real game changer in the early 1990s. And the researchers that worked on that were coming from this from a physical health standpoint. And what they were interested in looking at, especially, were potential links to things that had been experienced as children and how those manifested themselves in various aspects of adults' lives. And what they found out in particular through lots of some really interesting health research that they did was they found 3 different categories that had profound and lasting effects on adults in terms of their mental health as well as their physical health. And those fell into those 3 categories around abuse, neglect, and then household dysfunction as well. And I have a little shout out in the chat. Hi, Kara. It's so nice to be able to at least hear you. When it comes to trauma, what we've learned quite a bit about over the last couple of decades is that exposure to traumas, especially those acute and chronic traumas, happen at much higher levels than perhaps had been expected or understood in the past. It's remarkable to Rachelle and I to just consider that nearly 65% of children between the ages of 2 and 17 have experienced at least one traumatic event within a single year. That's remarkable. And as educators, we need to know that we can't go around trying to identify specifically all of those students without thinking about how it is that we're building systems to be able to support them. Trauma has an effect on school experience as well. Students who have experienced trauma are 2.5 times more likely to be able to fail a grade. They often have more receptive and expressive language difficulties. They're suspended or expelled more often, and they're disproportionately referred for special education services. Those adverse childhood experiences have lasting impact for adults as well. A greater likelihood of having cancer or diabetes later on in life, negative impacts around educational opportunities and income, negative impact in terms of depression, anxiety, mental health concerns as well. Those childhood experiences become a really important part of how it is that we help to address the needs of children to make sure that the past is not prologue to their future. When it comes to those adverse child experiences, this is not a cause and effect situation. This is correlation. There are correlations between the two, but those experiences don't sentence young people and adults to those negative outcomes. And I know in working with a student at the school where I'm at, she remarked to me one day, and I found this to be a place, words that I wanted to hang on to. She said, "I'm not my trauma. It doesn't define me. I define me." And those words are words that we all need to hang on to. Those protective factors are things that we do have a bit of influence over. Some really interesting research was done with 1,800 children who had experienced some form of maltreatment in their infancy up to the age of 3. And these children were followed for the next 7 years as they moved through schooling. And there were, for these children who were beneficiaries of a lot of these protective factors, they saw improved language and academic outcomes because these children had access to preschool education. They were surrounded with warmth and responsiveness in terms of their teachers and their caregivers. There was lots of instruction and intervention on pro-social skills and making sure that these children were connected to their communities. We have the ability to be able to influence some of these resiliency kinds of factors. 3 conditions that really help to be able to create more resiliency. And again, we have influence over these, making sure that there are those caring relationships, having clear and high academic expectations, and always coming from a culturally sustaining pedagogy that makes sure that we are always teaching from an assets-based approach and not a deficit thinking approach. And the power of those relationships that are developed in schools across school communities are so important for students. We know that students' relationships with teachers have this accelerating effect on student learning. Anything that falls into that blue zone, I'm drawing from the visible learning research of John Hattie, anything that falls into that blue zone represents an influence that has the potential of being able to accelerate student learning. And we know that no significant learning happens without that significant relationship. And it's even more powerful whenever we're talking with students outside of class, not only inside of class, but outside of class too. Your ability to be able to convey what those experiences are and that you're caring for them, they mean everything to children. I think about at the school where Doug and I are, I think about as one small representation of that. One of the educators that we work with, Demetrius, has a lot of social capital at our school. He is definitely somebody that the young people at our school look up to. And he is great for being able to make sure that he talks to kids as they come to school. And we had a newer student, a 7th grader, who didn't want to wear his glasses. And Demetrius knew that he had glasses, but this little 7th grader didn't want to wear them even though he needed them. And what Demetrius started doing was he started wearing his glasses rather than contacts. And he told him, I'm going to wear my glasses every day, and I want you to wear your glasses every day too, so that you and I both can be cool together. Those relationships mean something for students. We also know that student mobility has this negative effect as well. We want to build those protective factors. Children that move around a lot have a reverse effect on their learning. But again, a protective factor is making sure that they have friendships during those first days of school. And making sure that we are not creating a chilly classroom environment. Tom Good's research around looking at the differential teacher treatments for students that were perceived as being low achieving found that those students were criticized more often, they were praised less frequently, they got less feedback. And it's not always intentional, but rather it's where we put our attention. Are we putting our attention disproportionately on students that we perceive as being high achieving and therefore don't allow enough attention to go on students who we perceive as being low achieving? Another tool that you'll find in there is meant to interrupt this experience for students, especially without, we know that when students feel that they are disliked by their teacher, that it also has a reverse effect. So we've got another tool for you in those handouts as well, and that's the student-teacher relationship scale. Really useful for being able to examine closely for those students that are those hard to reach, hard to teach students, to examine how it is that you are building relationships with those students. This comes from Robert Pianta and his associates at University of Virginia, a phenomenal tool to be able to use. So we'd like to ask a chat discussion, put there in the chat, what is your relationship superpower? How do you make relationships happen with students? What do kids come to you for? Thanks for getting us started, Charles. Yeah, listening, absolutely. They know who are the people that are going to listen to them. Checking in with them, noticing when something is off. You know, I think about that scenario I started with, the student who starts the food fight in the cafeteria. Do you notice that something's off with this kid? Being authentic. Yeah, the eye contact. Eye contact means everything. Just let them talk. Making sure that there's lots of caring. And absolutely, Julia, talking to them about non-academic things, not just schooling all the time, using your good humor, being approachable. All of those things are part of, a piece of how it is that we create those trauma-sensitive schools, those relationships that are in there. I'm going to turn this over to Rachelle as she's going to take us a little bit further into those conversations about how we create classrooms that are trauma-sensitive as well.
Hello, and I'm going to apologize again for my puppy. She has reached the stage of the night that she has found her squeaky toys. So you will probably definitely hear her squeaking. Okay, so a lot of what Nancy was sharing related to the background of trauma. It obviously relates to socio-emotional learning as well. Trying to figure out how to change the slide. There we go. Okay, so there are the 5 tenets of social emotional learning, and we've kind of heard a lot about these through what Nancy was describing, identity and agency, emotional regulation, being able to really understand our feelings, our emotions, and how do we react, how do we interact, the cognitive regulation of being able to make decisions and be able to listen to directions and be able to follow classroom instruction. Social skills, we heard about the peer relationships, but being able to not only maintain, but repair relationships if there is a potential issue or a conflict, being able to communicate, and then public spirit for that engagement in social justice and civic and ethical responsibility. One important thing to note is that our interactions with our students really, they pick up on that, and they can perceive a tension or some disagreement based on how we interact with them. And so that's something that's really important to acknowledge. Another piece with social emotional learning, and Nancy commented about this in the beginning, this is something that is embedded throughout our own classrooms and ways that we're able to do that. And so this next slide really digs a little bit more into that first tenet of identity and agency. And so with identity, this really focuses on self-efficacy. And just as educators, we may not tackle something that's a little bit more difficult or something we're not comfortable with if we don't feel confident that we're capable. And so it's the same concept with our students' self-efficacy of they need to be able to identify who they are. We all have many identities, whether it's religious or it's cultural. And so having that feeling that they're capable of doing something, mastery at it. And then when we look at agency, it's, can we actually have an action? Are we going to be successful at making a change or doing something? And so these are very important when it comes to social emotional learning, which does connect to trauma sensitive practices, or if we think of culturally sustaining pedagogy. And so in your in the files, you actually have a sociogram map. To me, this is one of the easiest things as an educator we can look at from our own standpoint, but always give this to our students as well, for students to identify, who are they most comfortable in the class with, who are they comfortable talking with, who are they comfortable collaborating with. It talks about at recess or eating lunch with, because that gives us that insider knowledge as to where our students feel comfortable, if there may be potential issue, maybe there's some conflict in conversations. We get to know which students are comfortable with which ones, but also which students may not know anything about the others. And so it gives us a lot of this information. And so there are different rings. And so they identify where the students are and where they're most comfortable. And so maybe a student that's in one of the more outside rings, I might want to ensure that there's some sort of group work so that they continue to get to know one another and aren't always working with the same peers, so that they're building and maintaining on a constant basis. One of the things that, another way that we can embed social and emotional learning, and I had the pleasure of actually witnessing this when I was in California, and I was able to visit the school that Doug and Nancy work at, and they incorporate class meetings. And now we hear of these things, class meetings in elementary school quite often, that morning meeting, but this is a little bit different. And so first of all, before there was even a class meeting, the entire faculty met together, they formed a circle in one room, and they followed very similar this format where they talked about the old business, they gave the announcements that way. And then, they talked about new business and new things for all of the faculty members and staff to know. And then they did shout outs. They, every single time had an award for acknowledging something that somebody had done. And so that was my first experience seeing this concept of this type of a class meeting. But then when I was in the classrooms and predominantly in the social studies classrooms, every single class started with a class meeting, and they were in a circle, and they would either have, some old business and new business, but it was this concept of sharing. And so when I talk with teachers about building a classroom community, this was a perfect example of how the student's voice was included. And sometimes the topics dealt with something related to instruction the day before or instruction for that day, but often it was like your favorite person or a way to just be able to connect with one another regarding instruction, regarding personal beliefs and experiences, as well as the community and what's going on in the world. And I thought that was a really great way to build that social emotional learning. Something that Nancy talked about earlier was with behavior and the oftentimes where teachers misunderstand potential behavior issues. And so one of the things that we discuss in the book is this concept of restorative practices. This is not a new concept, and it's actually gaining a lot more traction in the last 5 to 10 years. But it's really being able to, rather than discipline and throw students out of a classroom or go to in-school suspension or all of these punitive pieces that may or may not actually accomplish a changed behavior or an understanding or maintaining and building those relationships. This type of practice, both of the students that are involved are in this conversation. And so you can see here the different types of questions that the child that was hurt is able to address, as well as the child that may have been acting in the first child's eyes inappropriately. And so it really engages this conversation that's really needed so that it's not just punitive. It continues to build that relationship, that understanding and miscommunication that may have occurred. So this is something that is very important in trauma-sensitive practices. And so moving into more specifics related to literacy, I do want to preface that there is no hierarchy in trauma. Often when I'm working with teachers, and even today I talked with some teachers with a colleague about some traumas that were going on in their school and in their community. And it was really important to understand that, first of all, somebody's hardship is not for me to judge. And so their hardship is their hardship. That's their trauma. And so we need to recognize that, understand that, and there isn't a hierarchy. And so if something is traumatic to me and something's traumatic to somebody else, it's not a one-up game. These are traumas, and we need to be able to figure out ways to embed these conversations and normalize it in the classrooms. And so with literature, I think this is where all of my trauma-sensitive background really stemmed from because of being a reading interventionist. And it's really being able to understand that when we read stories, we're interacting with those stories. We're taking our personal experiences and interpreting it differently. And we have research with transactional theory from Rosenblatt that talks about the fact that if I read a story about a main character that steals from a grocery store, and we read why they steal, I might have one experience if I come from a situation where it's difficult to have food on the table. I might read that story and look at that protagonist with care and with wanting to support and wanting to help and wanting to know more, versus somebody else reading that story may interpret it very differently. And so literature gives us that centering tool to be able to look at a character, look at their actions, look at how they resolve issues, how they deal with issues, how they go through different types of trauma, whether it's grief or it is neglect or it's abuse. I mean, we have literature for everything. And so it really gives us this opportunity to be able to read about it from the character's perspective first. And then through discussion, whether it's even if it's just myself of reading it and trying to problem solve of, okay, I see what this character did. We can think about, classic young adult literature like The Hate U Give and how voice was really an important feature for Star. And so how did they problem solve this? And then having these discussions with other people, whether it's in our class, with the teacher, very student-centered approach where the students are coming up with these interpretations. and discussing those social justices that they're, or social issues that they're reading, and coming up with, well, what would I do? And maybe I need to have more information. Maybe I need to research some more. Maybe I need additional resources. But being able to have these conversations stemming from the characters. So it's not personal yet. Now, students might make it personal and share their own experiences, which gives you that building of that communication, the protective factors of peer relationships and collaboration, and all of the things that we know are best practices. And so there are some important things like personal association, as I said, of, this is something that's really I can identify with, as well as usefulness. Where can I go with this? And so literature is a great way to start having these types of conversations because it's not through their personal experience right away. And so some of the ways to implement this, there are different things on here. Two that I'll discuss: literature circles, been around for a long time, but it's a great way where you're not necessarily using a whole class novel or a short story that everybody's reading. And so students are choosing based on maybe something that they can relate with in the text. Maybe it's a social issue, whatever it may be. And so students are in different small groups, they're reading, they're discussing, or you have sharing testimony and critical witnessing. I read about this through Elizabeth Dutro's book, and it's really this concept of, first of all, a teacher has to be vulnerable first. We have to be able to share a little bit about ourselves if we want our students to get to know us and we want to get to know them. I remember in class one time, in a high school level class, one of my students had commented, "I'm not giving you respect until, you respect me." And I'm like, well, wait a minute, I've always respected my students, but it was one of those things that I realized I need to be able to show this right from the start. And so same thing with being vulnerable, of sharing some things about ourselves, and up to you of what you want to share. We all have different experiences with trauma. We all have experiences that may be personal. They may be something that we witness, but we can share things. And so then by us sharing, our students are bearing critical witness to that conversation. And then it begins that reciprocal process. Now, I do want to be very clear that this is a developmentally appropriate piece that we need to consider. What texts are appropriate for the age group that we're working with? How can we share these conversations? And towards the end, I talk about the fact that we do need to be careful. We have to have that out plan and things that we need to consider when we open up these conversations in our classroom. It's not just we have a conversation about trauma and then you can just walk away. Definitely, we understand that there's a lot of things to consider. So those are some of the ways to incorporate literature and things that we can do with it. Another thing is writing as catharsis. Many of us have probably experienced times where we needed to write. We wanted to write out our feelings. We needed to write out a step-by-step plan of action. And so these are all different ways where the students can either write to themselves or they can write and share it. One of the students that I worked with a few years ago really wanted to write in the form of poetry. That was their creative outlet. And so through poetry, they were able to express their feelings and what they were going through. If we think about it, music is the lyrics of music. It's exactly that. A lot of music is sharing traumas and experiences. And even in the conversation I had earlier today with a student that is trying to understand how to process and deal with pretty much a mass shooting that had occurred. I said, why don't you invite the student to write? And then you can ask the student, do you want to share this with me or not? And so it's the same thing with that bearing witness and critical testimony. You always want to invite, you never want to require. And so if you have your students that want to write, you can ask them if they'd like to share with other people, share with other classmates. And for the younger kiddos, drawing sketches. We have lots of ways to communicate. And I think that this is one of the ways for them to express their concerns, ask questions, and share their feelings. And so in another chapter, we have teaching for empowerment. And so we kind of talk about the fact that there are a lot of ways to do this. And this is kind of where, in a lot of the classrooms that I work with, teachers are on board of, okay, I can figure out a way to modify my instruction. It relates to my standards. It relates to my curriculum. I'm still doing these things. It's just changing the how we're learning this. But they struggle a little bit with, well, how do I have action? Because when we think about culturally sustaining pedagogy, trauma sensitive is the same type of concept of we want to be able to go somewhere with this. And so there are 4 things that we talk about, which is the research piece. When I talked earlier, if you're reading a text about a student with a disability, maybe you want to investigate a little bit more about that disability. And maybe, you end up doing a project as to making a change in the community that was related. So you're connecting all of these dots. And so we're going to talk about that in a moment. And so prior to embedding and incorporating these additional projects and ways of representing instruction where we're keeping student centered, is we want to really think about these questions. And this came from Jeff Marshall's book. I have the pleasure of working with him at Clemson. And when I read his book, it really was like an aha moment of how many times we create curriculum, and that curriculum is because it was my favorite book, or it's instruction that we really, really wanted, to address, but it may not have dealt with the curriculum or the standards. And there are other ways that we can address standards a lot of the times. Not always. I know some districts have required readings and materials and everything. But with this, it's really making you stop and reflect. So how does this lesson that I want to teach relate to that bigger picture of my discipline? So whether it's a science classroom, it's a social studies classroom, whatever it is, how does this relate to the bigger picture? How does it relate to other disciplines? Because maybe there's some connection pieces across other disciplines, and maybe you want to incorporate other voices and cross over with curriculum. Is there a connection to current events? And how does it relate to my students? And so Jeff Marshall goes on to say, if the answer is that it doesn't connect to anything, maybe rethink why we're incorporating this. Is there a better way of teaching that material? And so another piece is civics at the school level. Something that we can do, and Nancy's going to talk about with the logic model that's in the packet, is how can we start having these conversations just in our classroom and in the school of what are their thoughts? What are they concerned about? What do they need to talk about more? What are the questions that they have, but they're not comfortable necessarily bringing it up? And this goes back to that silenced voice, where often students are experiencing traumas, but they don't think it's okay to talk about them in any way or fashion in a classroom, and also aren't comfortable going to a school counselor. And so then they're kind of stuck. And then they feel that it's a sense of shame because they don't know what to do. And so these are some anonymous questions that can be posed to find out more about what the needs are at the school. And so service learning is a way that we can embed some of these projects. It's very important to understand that service learning is not community service. This is an ongoing commitment and conversation and discussion with the people that you're working with to be able to have goals that are important to them and not just the person doing the work, like in community service. And so really understanding how can we make an impact, whether it's at the school level, it's at the community level, or it's global, of what are things that we can do. So maybe we read a novel, or we did some writing and some research, and now we want to have some action. And so that's where service learning can really come in. Highly recommend, if this is something you're interested, Wilhelm's book really goes into each chapter for each of these pieces of what does this look like and how can we embed it. And so the other thing I want to mention before I go to the last slide is inquiry-based learning. And that's something that I really use a lot when I'm working with literature for those supplemental texts, those resources. We have these overarching, essential questions that are really open-ended and thought-provoking. Students at times, when I've worked in classrooms, they've come up with those questions and then they investigate. And that's where they can really lead to maybe the end project is they go to a city council meeting and they share their findings, or I said earlier, depending on a student with a disability, and maybe there isn't a ramp at a local restaurant or something. And so it's really doing something based on that initial idea of, I don't know how or what or how, like what this means. And then through those conversations, naturally, our students are starting to realize that they are able to express what's going on in their lives, which goes to this last slide, which is a very, very, very important slide. First of all, teachers are not trauma-informed trained, as well as many school counselors don't have the specific training. But it's very important to be aware that we are not licensed therapists. We're not licensed mental health counselors. And so part of incorporating this in classrooms, and it goes to the logic model that Nancy's going to talk about, is it has to be a school-wide effort because of the fact that we have to have conversations with our school counselors, with the school psychologists, with mental health specialists, with community, people in the community. When I'm working on my research, I'm constantly talking to counselors in schools or just all these different pieces to say, well, what is it that you all do? What is it that you would need? What do you want teachers to be able to do? We need to be aware that re-traumatization can occur. And so that means we need to have some sort of an out plan. Anytime I start in the very first week of building that community with my students and demonstrating the care that we can all have, and we all have strengths and we all have weaknesses, I create some sort of an out plan. I want my students to know if we discuss something and they're uncomfortable, what do they need to do? How can they respond? Because we don't want to re-traumatize. We don't want there to be an issue in the classroom. And so again, that's that communication where for mine was to go to the office and to talk with a school counselor. Some of my students had a separate out plan. They just needed to go into the back of the room and, just have a safe space for them for a few moments. But you can negotiate that with the students. We also have secondary trauma, which is this idea that if something is occurring to other people or we're witnessing it, we're witnessing lots of trauma right now, and you might not be personally experiencing it. And that's that secondary trauma. And so being aware of, as educators, how do we handle that for secondary trauma that we're experiencing, as well as our students. And in the conversation I had today, she had commented, she's a mental health counselor, and vicarious post-traumatic stress. And so this concept of, it's more than just secondary trauma, but I'm experiencing what somebody else is going through. And I think a lot of us are experiencing that as we watch different political events right now, as well as the death toll with COVID. And so it's really being understanding of all of these pieces, as well as being upfront with our students about mandated reporting. I had a situation with a university school partnership where there was conversation and they both knew from the start that when a trauma and abuse was mentioned, there is mandatory reporting. So these are some of the pieces to consider when we incorporate these types of instruction. And so Nancy, I send it back to you.
I do that at least once a day. I start talking without turning my microphone back on. And before I move into the logic model and kind of thinking about the school-wide, I think you raised a really important point, and let's just kind of hang out with that for a minute. And that is around compassion fatigue, and an important acknowledgement that as educators, that perhaps colleagues are experiencing that compassion fatigue. There are lots of things that are happening to our children, to our communities, and we ourselves are under a lot of stressors. There is suffering within our own families as well. We're not getting to do the things that we normally are used to being able to do. And those issues around compassion fatigue are very real. And it is, think of it this way, compassion fatigue is the opposite of compassion satisfaction. That as educators, we draw on a lot of compassion satisfaction in what it is that we do. We all went into this field for reasons that didn't have to do with making tons of money and getting our summers off, right? We have these moral rewards that come with that. And those moral rewards are drawn in large part from having meaningful relationships with young people, making a positive impact on the communities that we live in and work in. And when we absorb a lot of the traumas that are experienced by our students or by our communities, we become vulnerable to that compassion fatigue. And those same kinds of outward signs that I talked about earlier with children are very much similar to the compassion fatigue that educators can experience as well. When you feel like you're teaching on empty, when you are emotionally exhausted as well as physically exhausted, when you find that you may be moving into a space where you have some more unhealthy behaviors that you're using to self-medicate. All of those are signs of compassion fatigue, and they are important to pay attention to in ourselves. They are important to pay attention to in our colleagues, and to know and utilize those supports that are available to us to be able to help as well. This has been a really difficult time to be able to teach, more so than usual. And that compassion fatigue is a very real experience. What we want to be able to do, we started out with talking about trauma, what some sources of trauma are, what are some of the signs of trauma, and then as we moved into especially Rachelle's space in talking about what does this actually look like to be trauma sensitive at the classroom level, what are the things that we can do that that can affect students in positive ways in terms of discipline. For instance, having a restorative practices approach, using literature to be able to elevate conversation and to help children see themselves and the experiences of others in ways that are important. We want to as well move that to the systems level and move beyond being informed about trauma to making sure that we're creating school systems that allow for us as organizations to be more trauma sensitive. As I said, it is not productive for children or for educators to think that the way that we can go about doing this is in a knee-jerk reaction to the single experiences of children where we are taking care of that child because we know that he's experienced some trauma. And oh yeah, don't forget about that girl over there because we know that she has experienced trauma as well. Instead, we need to build our organizations such that we can support children whether we fully know about their trauma or not, to be more proactive and not to adopt an individual child approach to being able to do so. There's been quite a bit of research around trauma sensitive schools and classrooms and what it is that those trauma sensitive schools and classrooms are able to do. The first step of that, yes, exactly, Janet, exactly, like taking universal precautions. I love that metaphor for that. Exactly. I so appreciate that. The first step of that, of course, is to understand what trauma is and what its impact is. That's becoming more trauma informed, if you will, to understand that healing happens and occurs through the relationships that children and families have with schools. Of course, to make sure that there are spaces for physical and emotional safety. And Rachelle certainly talked about the importance of creating those safe emotional spaces for children. It's also, though, some in terms of guiding principles, making sure that empowerment is something that happens for all. And although we only got a chance to talk briefly about learner empowerment, hang out with that word. What empowerment means is that you make sure that people have control and choice. And sometimes that means we got to let go of some of that control and some of that choice along the way. Making sure that those culturally sustaining practices are in place. Certainly the work of Paris and Elam and others has been so informative and so instructive on this account. Looking at students holistically, not just as a set of problems that they have experienced, but rather that assets-based approach, and especially using a collaborative approach. As Rachelle had noted, we can't fix everything. We are not trained to fix everything, but we can collaborate with other professionals to be able to do that. In a trauma-sensitive school, there's an understanding that there will always be students in our schools where we don't know the history, that maybe that trauma has never been identified, and we don't know where that impact has actually happened. So being proactive, putting those systems in place so that we can create a better net for students to be able to catch those students and support them, even when we don't know that we're actually doing that. So think closely about where it is that you are placing your energy, both individually as well as collectively. There's lots of conversation about what it means to have a good and positive school climate, right? There's lots of conversation on the importance of equity, but how do those factor into actually creating a trauma-sensitive school and not just allowing school climate, for example, to exist in a silo, and equitable school practices to exist in another silo? How do we create those ways of being able to interweave these concepts with one another? We have to create a healthy school ecosystem in order to be able to address all of those needs. We cannot do it alone. We cannot do it in silos. And one of the last tools that we have for you to consider is in using a logic model to be able to kind of map out where that work might be and how it is that as schools, as systems, as organizations, that we can harness that power and be able to ensure that we have greater impact that is amplified, and not just single devoted people that are at risk of experiencing compassion fatigue because they're taking on so much all on their own. They need support too. With a logic model, if you're not familiar with the working with logic models essentially work like this. It's a way of being able to kind of visually map out what are the resources that we currently have, what are the resources that we will need. As a second element or a second dimension, what are the activities, the actions that we need to utilize along with those resources? And then defining what are those outputs that we're looking for. How will we know that we are successful? How do we define what success is? And for those longer term outcomes as well, how is it that we will measure success, not only at the individual level, but at the community level? So as an example of that, what a logic model typically looks like is like this: those resources. If we have access to these resources, then these activities can be completed. And if we successfully complete these activities, then these changes will occur as a direct result of those actions. And if those activities are carried out as a design, then these changes will result. And at the outcomes level, that kind of those indirect benefits, if participants benefit from our efforts, then other systems, other organizations, other communities will also experience a positive impact. Mapping out complex ideas like this can be really useful, and using a logic model template can be quite useful. What we've developed for you is a logic model template that is specifically about trauma-sensitive schools. And this is just meant to be a stepping off point, not a specific map that you need to do all of these exact things, but rather we want to show you an example of what a logic model looks like in material kinds of ways when it comes to developing that trauma sensitive school. Those resources that you have and those resources that you need may include personnel, but they also include things like assessment tools. It may include SEL curriculum or training materials of one kind or another. Those activities, those actions need to be listed out. It's one thing to be able to say, yes, we should all be trauma sensitive, but if we don't back it up with action, then it just sits there and resides in that silo. It's also important to define what success looks like, those outputs, those direct benefits. How will we know that we have been successful? What are ways in which we will measure our success? And then finally, for the outcomes, those indirect benefits, who is it and what is it that we believe that we will positively impact? If you're a school leader, in particular, here's a way of being able to consider how it is to build towards trauma-sensitive schools. And this comes from the Safe Schooling folks. You can see the credit that's there. In that first phase, making sure that you're educating the staff about trauma and building those interdisciplinary teams. In phase two, looking closely at what our current practices are, and then developing plans so that we can expand those, we can amplify those. Chances are very good that you have silos of excellence that are in your schools. How can we make those be things that are further experienced by a larger number of people? And then in that third phase, to begin to integrate those trauma-sensitive practices, and importantly, to evaluate impact, to know what success looks like, and be courageous enough to be able to look closely at where it is that we're making progress and where are the places perhaps that we're kind of stalled along the way. So one final chat discussion as we wind up this webinar, and we'll move into some questions and answers. You've already put a lot of resources and tools into the chat. Are there other recommendations that you have? I've seen lots of conversation about teaching tolerance, for example, in staying up with current events. How to talk to young people. Are there other resources or tools that you'd like to recommend to the group? And as you're considering those and building on with those, just some reminders about taking this back and looking forward to all of that. I am always struck by the words of Rabbi Harold Kushner, who would talk with people about people that seem to have now successful lives as adults, but who came from what he termed as being unpromising circumstances. And he would ask, how did you get to be who you are? And he said that the answer always began with the same four words. There was this teacher. That person makes a difference in the lives of students. It's the place that we draw our moral rewards as well. So what's your North Star? What do you want to be able to accomplish with your students as well? We want to thank you so much for spending time with us as well. And we'd love to turn this over to any further questions, comments, things that you'd like to add as well. We've been trying to stay up on the Q&A all throughout the presentation. We are so appreciative of the work that you do. It makes a difference in the lives of young people. And I'll just kind of finish up with this parting thought, and love to hear from Rachelle as well about her parting words. You know, when I think about this extraordinary year that we are currently experiencing, a reminder that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, a student will come back to you, a former student will come back to you, and he or she will ask you, do you remember me? Do you remember me? You were my teacher during COVID-19, and you didn't give up on me. Sometimes I wanted to give up on myself, and you didn't give up on me. Know that you are making a major difference in the lives of children and young people, not only this year, but in the years moving forward as well. Rachelle, any parting words?
I mean, I want to thank everybody for being here. I did want to quickly, one of the Q&A questions talked about empathy. And I think that it's very important to have a solid understanding of empathy because, and somebody had mentioned earlier in the chat, Brené Brown's work of the difference between empathy and sympathy. And so I think that discussing healing through empathy is really important. Nicole Mira has educating for empathy, but we have to have that first understanding of what does that mean and how can that be used to promote resilience. And so I think that's a great question. Another question I really wanted to respond to, and hopefully Sarah's still on, was about administrators. How can we get them to focus on this? And I think it's conversations. It's sharing the statistics that Nancy talked about from the start. I know most of the conversations that I have, there's usually I don't want to say lack of knowledge, but just not an awareness of how many students are really facing trauma and all the different types of trauma and how that's influenced and how that influences learning versus just, oh, well, the student, you know, just can't read something. Well, why? What are we digging to? And so I think that it starts with those conversations. And as Nancy had shared with the logic model, you know, really following through with those first steps of this is important and this is because of fill in the blank. So I do appreciate everybody that came and the questions. They were all really important. That's it.
And I wanted to address another question that that came up through the Q&A, and that's Charles' question about doing this work while also holding an anti-racist approach. And I will speak from my own perspective. It is difficult to imagine how one can do that and do that really effectively without also using and looking through the lens of an anti-racist approach as well. I know, just as one example, one of the things that we have done over the last year is systematically, in collaborating with teachers, we've done a complete overhaul of all of the curriculum that we're currently using at our high school to make sure that we are building relevance and building that anti-racist approach right into their experiences. What does that mean in biology? What does that mean in mathematics? It has taken quite a bit of effort to be able to do so. We are certainly not there, done. We can wash our hands of it, but it's something that we see as being of ongoing importance.
And you can all see the puppy that you heard. She is very tiny, as was mentioned.
We heard the squeaky toy.
Yes. What a great way of ending it up to see.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for your time. Be safe, be well, well mentally, well physically, and we hope to see you again soon.
Yes.